Hi, I'm Børge Hansen, CEO of David Horn. Welcome back to Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. Today, we are happy to have Professor Dave Walsh and Dr. Ivar Fahsing with us to explore the groundbreaking initiative, ImpleMendez. This global effort creates an opportunity for collaboration and supports setting new standards for investigative interviewing and interrogation practices worldwide. Join us as we explore how implementing the Mendez Principles shapes the future of police interviewing and promotes justice and human rights across borders.
Welcome to the podcast Beyond Reasonable Doubt, today hosted by Ivar Fahsing. Today our guest is Professor Dave Walsh. Dave, thanks a lot for coming.
It's a pleasure. A really pleasure to be here.
Dave, there's a lot of things that we could talk about in this podcast, but today I really invite you to tell our listeners to what actually is ImpleMendez.
That's I can give you the recent history as to how we got here. And it started with a follow-up book idea that Professor Abel, I believe, and I germinated in very early 2022 when we swapped a phone call, exchanged ideas, and said we'd get back to each other. We reach out to people who hitherto had not had that much exposure in the literature and their country's practices. And that's building on an earlier book, 2015, which had some countries also which were at that time not well exposed, but also I'd call the usual suspects, the UK, Western European countries, and indeed USA, Australia, so on and so forth. But this time we made it purpose to just include those countries which had barely been mentioned in the literature, been covered in the literature, been exposed in the literature. And I knew that Ray, through his extensive travelling, and me through the contacts over the many years, would have had or could have access to many of these people in these countries. And so it proved to be. Much to our surprise, we had 40-odd people come back and say, "You would love to write a chapter on our country." And once we'd got that, secured that kind of commitment, which is really, it's turned into a recently published book called The International Handbook of Investigative Interviewing and Interrogation, covering, as I say, 40 countries. We were pleased with it. When we were hatching the idea of coverage, Ray said to me, we really ought to not just get them to talk about their country, but also how they responded to, if at all, to the Mendez Principles. And that was a good idea. And then I thought, but I don't want this book to be an audit, although it's great as that, but it also then borrowed that idea of Ray's and built on it, where we said, where's the implementation strategy? And I was told there isn't particularly one. So consequently, I then reached out to a number of people, yourself included, if you remember, and said, do you want to be part of a project which takes the implementation of the Mendez Principles, starts to actually create further movement in some countries, but certainly in others, initial movement towards implementation, without being naive that this would exceed any, in any country, 2-3 year project probably wouldn't see that much movement. But he was just really trying to get the thing moving. So we got to a point where, again, reaching out to people and saying, would you want to be part of this project? And we had 36 people come back to us from all over Europe. And and we were fortunate enough to secure the funding. That was May 2023. By the end, with the whole project started in October, one of the things we got to do when we got the money was find a name for it. And it was Action Vice Chair, Professor Yvonne Daly, who came up with the idea of the name, which I think everybody's quite pleased with that name, of ImpleMendez. But what it is, it just has just grown and grown as we speak now. In mid-September 2024, we've got near 250 members successfully submitted applications to join us, and indeed from 53 countries. So it's a network. ImpleMendez is a network facilitating collaboration, facilitating partnership, both within the academic arena, with academics and practitioners and policymakers, and so on and so forth, largely across Europe, but elsewhere too. Brazil, USA, Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, all involved as well. So we were really pleased and impressed by the enthusiasm of the majority of members who want to get involved. It's so wonderful to see this amount of energy, ideas, and commitment to the cause of improving investigative interviewing on a global scale, and wanting to do something in either their countries or in other countries where we've got a foothold. We're building in a strategy which ensures that something will occur afterwards. Partnerships, collaboration, teams will form from this, and indeed we've started to see that already. That's wonderful, symbolic of the energy in the whole project, as I say. So it's really, really good stuff, very rewarding.
We're talking about Mendez, just to make it clear to our listeners. I will not talk about the effective principles for investigation and information gathering that was headed by Professor Juan Mendez,
correct,
and published 2021?
June 2021, yeah.
So just to inform our listeners that these are now for short called the Mendez Principles, they are probably the first ever global drafted soft law-like document who says something about how is interviews and getting there, both strategically and methodologically, and also probably going a bit further than interviewing per se, but also about how to treat suspects, medical supervision, all those safeguards.
Yes, indeed.
So that's what we're talking about, ImpleMendez.
Implementing the Mendez Principles, ImpleMendez for sure, yeah.
But thanks a lot. I think it's fascinating to see how much energy there is around these things, which also is interesting in itself. Probably, maybe, I don't know, it's an indication that there is this mechanism here that is releasing something that hadn't been brewing.
Yes. It's the usual thing. You see it in pockets, but you don't see the totality of it until you actually give somebody, and ImpleMendez seems to be to have been that home, if you like, for people who've wanted to come and improve practice, policy, legal systems, better justice outcomes. And it's important to say, this isn't just for investigators, but it is, of course, but it's also for the legal professionals too, judges and judges, key people in this, key agents in this momentum for change, and getting these people on board and getting these people to understand the Mendez Principles is equally as important as getting officers who interview to understand them as well. So I think that's really good. And of course, lovely to see lawyers working with psychologists. It's always rewarding to see that. And that's why we're getting interpreters as well. We're another community. Yeah, linguists, you've got a lot of criminologists, sociologists, criminal justice, a real good range of academic and professional skills within the team.
Yeah, I guess for us, people like you and me who's been in the investigative interviewing, if you could call, research community for quite some years, there's no secret that there's probably been a dominance of psychology as a science in it, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
It's probably, as you're saying, time.
Yeah.
To see if we can activate and involve all the other professions that can add to this.
I absolutely agree. They've got a lot to offer. Those kind of insights, what works, and what is the right decided for argument's sake, and the human rights issues therein, which are really key to the Mendez Principles, critical. And psychologists need to understand that. And I think, yes, there's been a dominance of psychologists, and you can understand why, and to an extent, they've done very well. But I think it's so much better when you get people from different disciplines seeing the world from different perspectives, and that's good.
And as you said, the vice chair on this project, Professor Daly, she's indeed a professor in law.
She is indeed, yes, and again, she makes a very good point, this Professor Daly, that 10 years ago in her country, and 5 years ago in her country, probably as accurately, is that people didn't speak to each other from different disciplines, and indeed, she would make the point that the Garda Síochána, the Irish police, were also reluctant to engage with academics. So I think it's great to see these collaborations of all colours, as it were.
We had this what we call typically silos of knowledge, and I think so.
But of course, the reality is, in the real world, of course, the real world doesn't act in silos. You want a totality of knowledge, a greater coverage of knowledge, of understanding of law. And I think maybe, we've got one of our colleagues who's done some work, lots of good work on the experience of being detained by the police. Really interesting work. That, because we, as psychologists, they've tended to look what's happening in the interview room, but the experience of arrest and detention might be, we don't know, have an effect on the level of cooperation or resistance in the interview if it's been a pretty dreadful experience. So I think those kind of, bookending, combining those experiences are important to see if there is, something there, which, we might also be paying wider attention, broader attention to simply what goes off in the interview.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
We'll get back to more what are the activities and where you think these are heading. But first of all, for our listeners, who's Dave Walsh? How did you get involved in this at all?
I remember achieving a particular grade, which was executive officer in the civil service, UK civil service, and being a staff trainer. So I learned how to perform and enjoy the performance. But that was a short-lived post. And I remember being asked by one of the managers, did you want to work on fraud investigations against the public purse, as it were? And yes, I'll do it for a couple of years, I said. Then I'll look somewhere else. Well, those 2 years still haven't finished. Here we are, nearly 40 years later. My first ever interview with a suspect was on the 20th of January 1986. The UK's Police and Criminal Evidence Act had just been put into practice. It had that on the 1st of January that year. There's the thing, I was really nervous. And so was the suspect was the least criminal of all the suspects I think I've ever seen. He was really nervous. You just couldn't wait to get it over. And thank goodness, this is before recording. We were having to write down our interview, what we came to be known as extraneous notes, which my mentor was doing in the background whilst I was talking to this guy. But that's an interesting point because, of course, for a good few years, I lost my nerves. To a great extent, you always feel a little bit apprehensive as you approach an interview. But also, without doubt, I thought I was getting better. I got the results for the organisation. These interviews were still not being recorded. I was getting results. And, I was developing a reputation as a result. But I thought I was doing all the right things. Nobody was really monitoring my interviews. They were just looking at the bottom line. Look at the results it brings in. Look at the number of cases he solves, or the number of admissions he gets, because he was, they were, and I thought I was doing a great job, and so did the organisation. So this idea that, I was getting better, I've soon learned in the mid-1990s, having gone to a training course which talked about psychological levers, and the basis of that 1995 course was still that these people were guilty. And you mustn't show doubt in that. 1 year later, we went on a completely different course, and it changed me. I realised that what I was doing well was not something that people should do in interviews. And so, that shook me to the core. And I realised I had to change my ways. But this was good because the results were so easy because you were doing very unsavory things and getting quick results. This was a much more skillful approach that I was learning. And there was a point in my career, almost 10 years in now, where I was getting bored. So the idea then of getting to do a more skillful job, I feel more professional.
So going beyond admission.
It's gathering information, gathering much more than that which we solved, but into looking into other crimes that might have been committed as well. So it was great, and that set me off on I wanted to learn more and more about this more skillful approach. I took a master's degree at Portsmouth. And then in due course, I became a manager of investigators at the same time. I'd done some training of investigators, and a manager of investigators. And so during that period of time, I was beginning to really develop an idea about this investigative interview. It really had caught my attention, and I had some academic success, as I say, at the master's level. Then that dissertation was supervised by Professor Milne, and then I had the great fortune, and I still regard it as one of the great fortunes of being assigned to Professor Ray Bull, as my PhD supervisor. And I had really got to the point where I thought I need to really understand what's going on in interviews. I really need a real in-depth, and this is how I'm going to keep motivated, by understanding beyond the superficial level how to interview and what's happening, the dynamics, and what are the keys to success. Because, you're still asking investigators that they all give you various reasons as to what was, the typical I can tell when people are lying stuff, which we know was evident. People still tried to undertake the old approach of scaring people into confessions, psychologically, I had to say. And then 2 years into the PhD, I thought this would curb my academic wandering, just do a PhD. But actually what it did do, right, so is increase it. I really went, and I thought I'm going to change careers into academia. Having then, at some later point in 2010, completing successfully, defending my thesis, which was about how the interviews with fraud suspects. By this time I was so far into it, this subject, and really was enjoying the world of academia as well. It really has given me space, which I had never had, that kind of space, and time for thought, time for reflection, time for intellect. And I think psychology was just happy just to see what was happening in interviews. I needed to know whether those that particular model, which I, by this time, was a huge proponent of, actually worked in terms of doing what it said it did, which was gather information. And that probably was the key area, finding what was the outcome of such. It wasn't just doing the right thing, but it was also achieving the right outcomes. And that's what I found in my thesis, that rapport building, undertaking of the peace model, all when done skillfully, not just when done, but when done skillfully, produce better outcomes. And at the same time, when it was done unskillfully, it actually didn't achieve the same number of outcomes or the same quality outcomes. So clearly there's an association between good things being done as prescribed, recommended by the peace model, and the outcomes that it set out to achieve, regardless of whether the person confessed. If he did, well, we just kind of say that. Well, that's even more interesting, but the reality is they got full accounts when he was done most skillfully. It really was a revelation.
And the model you're talking about now is what we know as the peace model.
We really didn't get that much guidance. I mean, the problem was, of course, is the great idea of getting everybody trained. But, this is usually you meet up against the cost of training and the cost of abstracting people from the front line and having to cover for them. And they got a week training. And for some people, not for all, but for some people, they needed a training course on basic communication skills, and then moving to the peace model and thinking about, planning. What is good planning? What does it involve? And of course, as things went on, I realized, we were being encouraged to plan, sit down, do a interview plan. This is all very good stuff. But it occurred to me, of course, that planning was not just something that was done when you knew you got got to a point where you needed to interview somebody about suspicions. It's the very things that you were doing immediately you took on the case for investigation. The hypotheses you generated or didn't, the leads you followed or didn't, the conclusions you drew from incoming evidence and the further generation of hypotheses as a consequence of what was coming in were all part of the planning and preparation for the interview, because if you don't do that, it's evident in the interview you've not made those kind of ongoing planning and preparation steps.
Sometimes I think misused term of open-mindedness is an active thing, something that comes from all those things you're addressing here.
Yeah, I mean, there still is a tendency to form conclusions too quickly. I'm inclined to think that if you've got the investigator who becomes quite reflective and evaluated of what he or she is doing and is thinking of all what might possibly have occurred in a particular case, and from those hypotheses start to discount those by inquiries made that they probably didn't happen and definitely didn't happen, then you're starting to healthily narrow down and healthily become more suspicious, rather than this has happened so many times in my career, I know what's happened here. I'm not thoroughly doing that. So I think when it's this idea of open-mindedness is, I don't think it's possible for some people, but it needn't be important if you've really done the very thorough investigation. You've not jumped too quick to conclusions. You can really say, look, this probably happened because I've discounted other possibilities, and in a way that you can be proud of. And I wonder how many times that happens. Unfortunately, I don't think people, that's one area you would want to say better decision-making, judgment, thinking, and you want to see this area of research expanding on. That is much more to do in that area. What happens during investigations is much more expensive to do. It's much more labor intensive, but it's probably what is needed now, because we call it investigative interviewing. We forget the investigative part and concentrate on the interview being the thing which cracks open the case. And of course, it's the investigation which really, if done thoroughly, comprehensively, effectively, is that which leads to the right conclusion. But we forget investigative part or underplay it, and we really do need to, the academic community needs to step up there, I think, and look at that area.
Well, absolutely. That's probably what we found out after implementing investigative interviewing in Norway. Me and my dear friend Aspen Reckler were discussing where is actually this taking us. And we saw after 10 years into that implementation that this didn't just change the interviews. It indeed changed the whole way we were thinking of. So we kind of reformed much more than the interviewing itself. And as you say, there is still such a great potential. And not only, as you probably know, in Norway, we have an integrated prosecution service. Yeah. So when we did this, it also challenged the whole system that was involved in interviewing and or in the investigations and prosecutions as such.
Now, there was a recent paper published in it was a meta-analysis, and the conclusion from the study of studies was that people generally veer away from mental effort. But if there's a culture...
Cognitive measures.
Yes, indeed. In what circumstances? Because it doesn't happen in every time. There are times when that mental effort becomes part of the deal. He uses in the study the idea of chess players. They have to engage in mental effort because they realize it can't be done without that mental effort. That's an area where we need to show that mental effort, that cognitive demand is part of the deal. It's not an add-on. It's not a luxury, a bonus if it's used. It has to become part of the interviewer skills, applying the mental effort. So headaches are guaranteed a necessary part of the job.
Absolutely. As you're probably aware of, the way we do this in Norway is built actually not on a theory from within police investigation, but indeed from a PhD in Sweden, and how judges think when they acquit in the Swedish Supreme Court. And that is exactly where this idea of hypothesis comes from.
Yeah.
What can't be ruled out as a possible explanation for this evidence or this incident, if that hasn't been actively investigated and reasonably ruled out,
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
well, then the suspect and accused should be acquitted. And so that's probably what we today would call investigative quality.
Yes, absolutely.
That has to be reflected not only in the investigation, in the interview, but in all those areas that we build evidence from.
Yeah. And that's professional investigators. That's what a professional investigator should do.
Probably good detectives and investigators have done that throughout times, but maybe not been consciously aware of what am I actually doing when I'm good and when am I not so good.
Yeah. What do I do? Yeah. And the importance of it. And building culture, this is the way forward, I would say, for investigators, is to capture that and celebrate it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting that you say that as such a recognized specialist within the area, because actually myself, when I'm doing trainings abroad now, I don't call it investigative interviewing anymore. I call it investigations and interviewing, just to make it even more clear that this is a kind of a multifaceted process and not just interviewing people.
Yeah, I can see why.
But Dave, what you're saying is that you actually wanted to see, does it really work?
Yes.
And what did you actually find?
I found there was an association, because this is applied. This is completely applied, done by people who've been trained in the PEACE model. And if I'm correct in thinking, because I was, at the time I started this study, I was part of the training section. I was the regional trainer. So I had access to training records, and I could see how those who had received the training some of those were better than their counterparts who had yet to be trained. And, there was that link, there was that association, the correlation between good interviewing skills and good interview outcomes, the right ones, and gathering a full account so that you'd be probably pretty confident that whether the case was to go to court or whether it was actually resolved in another manner, that was the right outcome. And the possibility of the person, when they did confess, a bit of confessing out of fear, many of the suspects were clearly naive of the criminal justice system. There were very few. The training that clearly paid off in avoiding those bad things, bad practices and malpractices, but also very good at, when it was working well, they got information from good open questions. You could see them wanting more training in the way that they planned and drew up a strategy. And it's interesting, when we retrain, and we did from time to time retrain investigators, that they had forgotten about the planning element, where that part of the planning element would concern how, in what way we were going to introduce evidence, what way we were going to introduce topics. It was pretty much, I'm going to say it was chaos, that they clearly hadn't been much thought about in what way we were going to do this. That certainly, for me, I don't think that you can master that art in just 1 week. I think that's when you probably need to go back and have a refresher training, which builds on those kind of initial skills, but also extends those skills to talk about those very complex tactics and indeed interview responsibilities as well. So I think that's what I wanted to see, further training on in the really more challenging areas of right topics, right questioning strategy, right evidence disclosure strategy, building rapport and maintaining rapport. I mean, this is, I forgot that for the moment, is that the most cited piece of work is that I have found that there was too much talk about building rapport. And for me, what I established is that rapport was at its best when it was not only, it could be lost, even if it had been built in the first place. As the interview progressed, it can be lost. B, when it wasn't lost, when it was maintained, that too illustrated the not only the importance of rapport, but the importance of the PEACE model, because again, its outcomes, the amount of information gathered, increased along with rapport not only the main building, its maintenance, but also the skillful use of building and maintaining rapport, when you've got to touch on some pretty difficult subjects, for people, which might have pretty life-changing consequences.
When you say rapport, for us, it's obvious what you mean.
So it's really, about, and the onus on the interviewer to work at the level, capabilities of the interviewee, to adjust, but get on that kind of wavelength, get on that kind of harmony, and I think, and it's doable, even with the most difficult of suspects.
And probably also including dealing with challenging behavior.
Yeah. I think Orbit is a classic example of showing that at certain points in their career, investigators need to go back to the training room and take on, because Orbit is quite complex. It's also absolutely necessary, by the way. The model is something that I most agreement with, or more agreement with. But one thing that I found in the peace model, and I've asked various people why this was in a week they also had to teach them something else. And interviewers, by chance, are action learners, but they are not necessarily by design reflective learners. And yet, of course, the growth, it certainly was evident in my career, but I've seen it in others, is that the growth, the understanding of the need to accurately reflect and evaluate and appraise one's own performance, and indeed reflect and appraise a peer, or indeed as a manager, investigator's performance fairly, consistent against standards, in agreement with standards. Evaluation, the second E of the peace model is not only about case evaluation or ongoing evaluation as the interview proceeds, but it's about personal growth. We know from adult learning that if it's not reinforced by self-evaluation, peer evaluation, supervisory evaluation, and good, timely feedback, we know that skills deteriorate.
Like any skill.
Like any skill. You would want to see that embedded into professional practice. In England and Wales, and in other countries too. What do we get? We have uncontaminated evidence of what happened in the interview recorded. And I say to my investigators, when was the last time you looked and listened at your own performance? And of course, then it's about, how do we measure? How do we know we've done well? And where we could improve. Those things need to be, certainly looked at. And there are some models there, which aren't, which you can't avoid. We know that people, when they self-evaluate, usually tend to exaggerate. For some of that, it's about maintaining personal self-esteem in a particular area where it's important. Investigators want to be good interviewers.
Exactly.
Yeah. But there are some places where you can't hide, and some tools where you deliberately, when, at what point did you summarize? Did you summarize at all? You ask them that question, they go, yeah, we do, and we know they don't. It's not just because I happen to be have a sample of non-summarizers. It's I've seen it time as an investigating manager, as an investigations trainer, and as a academic. The absence of summary, appropriate the summaries, by the way, the absence of rapport, the lack of forethought about evidence disclosure and questioning strategies are all pretty laid bare. And there are tools to help people become aware of areas where they need to improve. Because I got the result there, what could I have done better? And it really, that's the hallmark. You want to be called investigation professionals, as I tend to find that people want to be called that. Then one of the hallmarks of professionalism is that being undertaking of these various forms of evaluation. I learned it the hard way. I wasn't a natural reflector. I was somebody who got the job done. It's only when you realize that you need to improve somewhere. And again, it's hard, but it is worthwhile. And I would say, if I can be seen as having a successful career, the point when I embarked on what might be reasonably called success was the time when I stopped being the all-action hero and being the complete learner, which included, of course, not overthinking, but certainly reflecting and evaluating action planning for the next interview. But once you master the art, it becomes part of you. There will be times when I'll look back on this interview every time I do a presentation to a greater or lesser degree, I'm thinking about what worked, what didn't, what can I, what I should have done, what I should have included and probably brushed over too quick, and all those things. It's not beating yourself up, because you also look at the things that went pretty well, because you want to keep them in your set of skills in the next time you do that task. But yeah, I would say that of all the things I've done, learning to reflect opened my mind, but it certainly opened doors, as well. And I love it. I think I really want people to become not scared to reflect, and not avoiding reflection.
Well, absolutely. I completely agree. But on the other hand, it takes time and it also takes effort. I was wondering, is it about time that we also spend time and resources to try to develop a full simulation suite?
You see, I really enjoyed a presentation I heard given by Jodie Koss colleague, because this is really embryonic stuff, this area. Has it got legs? I would like to think so. One of the reasons why I quite like the idea is the concept of being able to just, not necessarily organize huge training sessions, but having something that they can, half an hour and have a fresh training with an avatar there. I think that this really should be explored to see how far we can go building resistance models, be built, all the type of uncooperation, different forms of for different reasons, lack of cooperation and fear, and all those. I think if technology can get those various, so simulation is only in the fact that it's in a training room, it's in with an avatar rather than a real person, but the reality of the situation, other than those things, is what you would get outside. That's an interesting model to pursue, that is.
One of the things I was going to ask you is that, would you think that at some point in time we would be having some kind of standardized accreditation system for interview? Does that make sense?
Well, I don't know what you're saying, and paper, it sounds quite attractive, quite appealing. At the same time, I think one of the biggest I've been fortunate enough to not only work with these people from various countries, but also have had the good fortune to visit some of these countries over the last 2 or 3 years. And there has to be an acknowledgement that there are some culturally important matters in that country as to how things came to be, and will overarch any training, any interview model. And for me, as I've said many times, where's the science? One of the areas where science needs to grow. I mean, we would talk about psychology being almost a Western conceived subject. Is that does the psychology, or does these interviewing techniques cut across cultures easily? The point I should really, but this maybe where the science needs to improve is what do we need to do to adapt the principles without distorting them. So, absolutely crucial in order to fit a particular country without going, actually, it's this country which needs to change a little. And I think we've got to kind of still hold some of the principles to keep consistent with them, but at the same time recognize that in some circumstances, adaptation, not necessarily modification, adaptation without distortion is required. And again, that's it's the exciting thing, is finding out what those adaptations are like. As you're going to a criminal justice system which is not adversarial but inquisitorial. Does that require a different approach? Not on the face of it, I probably don't think it is. But let's keep exploring that, because it's an argument that people might use, and we need to kind of counter it.
I was thinking more basic skill is like if you compare it to driving a car.
Yes.
It's quite obvious today that you would require a driving license. It's not to make you a Formula One driver.
No.
It's to make you the minimum.
Yes.
That's required.
Yes. Those non-negotiables you've got.
Well, as we do have various criminal justice system, perhaps it could be easier to start with the universal legislation. you have certain things that's already there that you cannot just ignore, like the civil political rights. So these kind of minimum things that could at least be maybe a beginning of a global accreditation that probably all of us could agree on.
And of course, we've got the great opportunity, haven't we? But now we've got the Mendez Principles. The Mendez Principles provides the framework and very kind of standards those common standards, universal standards that we should be applying. They're there now. So this is a great moment. What have we learned over the last 20 years or more, but not much more, I have to say, is that we've learned that doing things badly, malpractice, leads to bad outcomes. We've learned that there are certain things that we do which are ethical and skillful as an investigator can lead to good outcomes. We've learned that. We've built the science up. So we've got all that. No better signal change when they've all fallen into this document, the Mendez Principles. What a signal change to say, look, we are now at a point where we can confidently declare in any language you like what works.
Exactly.
Evidence-based.
And what I would like to add to that, Dave, because we can also probably agree that although the peace model and what we call investigative interviewing is a bigger thing, that the whole area, what we think about that can contribute to better interviews, is has spread, but not the way we were hoping for. Especially maybe like in the US, it's not kind of blooming the same way. But is it your impression that the Mendez Principles actually could be bridging some of these different communities and gaps?
I think more needs to be done to ensure that there's a greater recognition, and indeed this really does require policing leadership and state leadership to say, look, this is the document, we've got this expertise, we're in a position where we can confidently say what doesn't work and what does work. We don't need to be arguing the case anymore. What we need to be doing is going, right, let's move it on. We've got this wonderful document, let's implement it. I have a great example from the new book, where one country says we now are introducing interview recording. And I have to say, interview recording alone is a great step forward, but it's one of many steps which need to be taken. You've got an exception which is being now utilized much more than it ever intended to be, for avoiding the recording of interviews in that country. So this exception is becoming the norm. And the very fact that police leaders and managers at all different levels are clearly not that bothered, sending out the wrong message. If interviewers think, well, nobody's telling me to, so I won't. So this is where police leaders need to step up to the mark and say, look, we were told there's no going back. This new way of recording interviews is the way forward. You do it.
On that note, I want to thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
I got you warmed up.
Talking with passion, mate, about a passionate subject.
Thank you for joining us for this insightful discussion with Professor Dave Walsh on the transformative power of the ImpleMendez initiative. Don't miss our next episode, and remember, change starts with a conversation.